Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Chiba, and I direct the program on science and global security here at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. And it's my honor this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Dr. Hans Blix. Those who follow international affairs are well aware of the current controversies over the nuclear programs of Iran and North Korea. There's a perhaps related controversy having to do with the fulfillment by the 5 nuclear weapon states under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of their obligation under Article 6 of that treaty to pursue nuclear arms control and eventual nuclear disarmament. That controversy extends to the question over which the spread of nuclear weapons really is or is not connected to the fulfillment of those 5 nuclear weapon states of that treaty pledge. We could hardly have a better person speaking to us today to illuminate those connections than Dr. Hans Blix. Dr. Blix started his career as a doctor of law at Stockholm University in 1959 and began government service in 1963. He eventually rose to the position of Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden in 1978. From 1981 to 1997, Hans Blix served as Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency and was charged with overseeing inspection of Iraq's nuclear program. In 2000, he assumed the position of head of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission, UNMVIC, during the contentious period when the existence and verification of so-called weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was hotly debated in the UN Security Council, as was the question of whether the existence of those so-called WMD were cause for war. He retired in 2003 and is currently the chairman of the International Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction, also known as the Blix Commission, which began work in January of 2004. We have here this evening a few more copies that have not yet been taken of the report of that commission, and you're welcome to pick up a copy on your way out this evening. I'd also like to call to your attention Dr. Blix's book, Disarming Iraq, which is exactly about the controversy over the so-called WMD programs in Iraq. And I'd like to ask you now to join me in welcoming Dr. Hans Blix.
I thank you very much for that kind introduction and also for the excellent advertisements of the report on the weapons of mass destruction and on my own book, which you can now get in pocket. It was published by Bloomsbury in the UK. I don't know whether it still exists in this hardcover in the US. I'm delighted to come here to speak to you about the time for revival of disarmament, and the more delighted for the invitation as it is the second time, and I treasure even more a second invitation than a first invitation to a university. Universities are institutions that cultivate our ability for critical thinking and unbiased observation, and we need this ability in scientific research, but also when we assess national and international questions before we reach conclusions and decisions on actions. And it is not so easy to come to critical conclusions about what's going on in the when we are bewildered by the barrage of information from different quarters that may not be so unbiased. And I'm reminded of the story of the famous saying by President Lincoln that you can fool some people all the time and all people sometime, but not all people all the time. And I hear that the spin doctors nowadays in Capital say that this is much too pessimistic a view. Well, that's what we have experienced. But it's also more practical consideration than just reaching a correct assessment. There's also, we know that if you do not have the right diagnosis, how can you apply the right therapy? The war in Iraq was not based upon the right diagnosis. there were no weapons of mass destruction. I shall have more comments on Iraq, but my main subject is more general, and that subject is it time for a revival of disarmament? And for those who were not here when Kofi Annan spoke about a similar subject not so long ago, I'd very like you to recommend you to read on the web what he said, because I can't say it as well as he did. I'm not alone in raising the question whether it's time for disarmament, nor am I alone in answering yes to the question. On the 4th of January this year, the Wall Street Journal, that bastion of liberal thought, published an article by Kissinger and Schultz and Bill Perry and Sam Lum, and it was entitled Nuclear Madness. And they really advocated nuclear disarmament. And Gorbachev wrote not long thereafter that in his view the statesmen of the 1990s had missed an opportunity to move the world forward towards a sort of peace settlement after the Cold War. Kissinger and his co-authors were arguing that during the Cold War, a nuclear deterrent was justified and necessary, but after the end of the Cold War, this continued possession of large quantities of nuclear weapons was more a drawback and a danger than anything else. And he urged that the U.S. should take the lead in approaching the leaders of other nuclear weapon states with a view to agreement on disarmament. And of course, he was not thinking about anything taking place overnight. It will take time, but we are not going in the right direction at the moment. Where are we actually at the present time? That's my first question. Al Gore has shown us one inconvenient truth about global warming, and Kofi Annan has shown us the other one, that we are sleepwalking into arms races. And I'd like to illustrate that. We have read recently about the criticism and concern expressed by Russia and by Mr. Putin about the placement of elements of the missile shield in the Czech Republic and in Poland, and the possible countermeasures that Russia may take. Well, whatever you think about this exchange of views, it certainly is not one that is dealing with disarmament, but rather one about rearmament. We can also read about the space race, and we heard about China sending up a missile destroying one of its old weather satellites, causing a great number of debris, something that hadn't happened in the 1980s. How we should interpret that shot is not quite clear, but again, it was not a sign that we are going to further detente, but rather a sign of worry, perhaps by the Chinese, that they they fear that there's a risk of conflict in the future. Some people have also interpreted it as a sign that they would desperately like to have negotiations about non-placement of weapons in space, something that is a risk at the present time. Now, lastly, the US and the UK development of the new generation nuclear weapons is not exactly signs that we are going towards further detente and disarmament. The UK Parliament endorsed the British government only the other day to go for something to follow up on the Trident generation in the United Kingdom. And in the US, the administration seems to have concluded that they would like to go for a new nuclear weapon. In both cases, they will take stores of nuclear weapon up to well beyond 2050. So they do not seem to envisage an early exit from the nuclear weapons era. President Bush has spoken about 9/11 as the Pearl Harbor of the Third World War. A world war, then I presume, against terrorism. And in Europe, I think very few people would quite understand this, but those who have lived closer to 9/11 perhaps understand it better. Nevertheless, I think it is certainly not indicative of a great hopeful attitude towards detente. And I note lastly that the military expenses of the world today is about $1.3 trillion for the whole world, after which about half of it is paid by you as American taxpayers. China is, according to its own report, spending about $45 billion. So perhaps we could characterize the situation reigning at the moment as a cold peace. coming after the Cold War. Now, my worst fear in this situation is that rather than more cooperation, which is needed between big powers in a globalized world on ecology and economy and development and human rights, we might see an old-fashioned effort at renewal of bloc building. And the reasons why I fear this is when I see inter alia, the US agreement with India, that is hard to interpret in any other way than a wish to build up a sort of cordon, a belt of countries to block China and keep China in check, with India, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and perhaps Taiwan. And the other fear I have is about Russia, when seeing the Russian reaction to the missile points in Czech Republic and in Poland, and also hearing about the ideas and wishes to enlarge NATO further. We have had an expansion of NATO into Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and the Baltic states, who in reality were occupied by Russia during the Cold War, and it's understandable that they wanted to have a new security. But what we now hear about is the possibility of inviting Ukraine and Georgia. And Senator Lugar spoke last autumn at a meeting in Riga also that said that NATO should keep its doors open for Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. And I was interested to see that Kissinger, after having written an article about nuclear madness, he came out a few days ago about an article in which said he had been an ardent spokesman for the expansion of NATO to the three countries, but he felt that it might be counterproductive and risky to expand this further, and that indeed my conclusion is that both in the cases of China and Russia, that while the intention is to create a balance that and based upon a fear that these countries will grow with the natural resources and with the economic development they have, that actions like these from the outside may perhaps provoke the backlash and provoke precisely the kind of strengthening of their military positions that they would like to avoid from this side, and in my view be trying to embrace them, trying to include them into the international community of the various organization, cooperation in terms of defending our environment or defending ourselves against contagious diseases and a lot of other things which absolutely require cooperation, that this would be a better way than a purely military response to handle them for the future. Well, so what's being done could be self-fulfilling. Another fear, however, and the one I have, is you can hear from Washington, and that is the fear that the worst weapons will fall into the worst hands. And then which are the worst weapons? Well, I'll tell you a story to lighten up this rather somber subject, a story I like. Some of you might have heard before. Some months ago I had an email from a lady in Canada, and she said that she was planning to name her cat after me. She wanted to call it Blix, and did I have any objection to that? And I mailed back that said that no, both my wife and I are great cat lovers, and I felt honored by this, but I wanted to know if the cat accepted it. And after a while I had an email back and said that, yeah, the cat seems absolutely content with the name and now works beautifully as a weapon of mice destruction. Now, the worst weapons that I'm talking about, and which are defined in this report of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, is those that are being coined as weapons of mass destruction for a long time: the nuclear, biological, and chemical, and the missiles to deliver them. So those are the ones I talk about. One could have some discussions about the justification of that group, because in fact we know that small caliber weapons are the ones that kill most people in the world today, and there are efforts made to try to restrict at least the illegal trade in small caliber weapons. So that's a very, very big chapter, and we have not dealt with that, but it's a highly valid chapter. So I'm going to talk about what have we done about these weapons, the nuclear, biological, and chemical. And I note then that we have comprehensive conventions about biological and chemical weapons, but not regarding nuclear weapons. In 1972, President Nixon took the initiative to a convention prohibiting the biological weapons, both the production and the use and the stocking of biological weapons. Now, at that time, in 1972, the Soviet Union would not accept any inspection at all. They regarded all outside inspection, on-site inspection, as espionage. So there was no mechanism for inspection attached to the treaty. And lo and behold, we found that the Soviet Union breached the treaty. They had a very large biological weapons program. And we also found that Saddam Hussein breached the treaty, and he had a program, although neither of them fortunately made use of their biological weapons. The weakness about the absence of a verification mechanism and implementation mechanism remains. And today, in 2001, there was a review conference in which the US simply rejected the plans that had been worked out for a long time for verification implementation mechanism. And there was quite a shock to the world to hear Mr. Bolton deliver the no at that conference. Last year, there was another review conference every 5 years, 2006, and the tone was much calmer and more constructive, and it's not an easy thing to really design a good implementation mechanism, because nuclear installations are relatively few, and you can have inspection attached to them. In the field of biology, you have many laboratories and scientific institutions in the world where they are capable of design bugs and design viruses. So there are very big obstacles in the way of getting a reliable implementation mechanism. But at any rate, the climate has improved very much since 2001. So much for the biological. Now then the chemical. The field of chemical weapons, we had a convention concluded after the end of the Cold War in 1993. And it was, perhaps one could say, a harvest of the end of the Cold War and of the détente. It was reached after decades of negotiation. And it has a very extensive system for inspection in which they had learned a lot about the successes and the failures of the IAEA inspection. Now, Iraq used chemical weapons extensively against the young boys that were sent forward from Iran, and used it also, as you know, at Halabja against their own Turkish citizens. Now, that convention prohibiting both production, stocking, and use of chemical weapons is in reasonably good shape. There is an organization set up at The Hague for inspections, and they verify both the chemical industries and verify the destruction of the stocks of chemical weapons, which you are undertaking in the US and in Russia. There are a lot of delays in the program, but nevertheless it's going on, and I think it's in reasonably good shape. Now, for the nuclear weapons, we have no convention prohibiting the use of it. There was a decision, rather an opinion, by the International Court of Justice about 10 years ago on the legality of nuclear weapons. And they saw a very limited area of possible legality for it. In most cases, they say that it would violate some existing rules of international law, very often the rules which prohibited the use of indiscriminate weapons and weapons of warfare. But they didn't say outlaw, say that was totally forbidden. They could see situations in which there could be legal use. So there is no convention either, in the same way as the BC Convention or the Chemical Convention. During the Cold War, you remember the world reached about a peak of some 55,000 nuclear warheads. And I remember, and we talked then about MAD, or the mutually assured destruction, that we all feared. There was a lot of anguish about it. People were marching in the streets. And I remember from that period, a Danish poet who wrote in a newspaper a little verse that I never forget. He said that the noble art of losing face may one day save the human race. Well, that was well found. Actually, being a protagonist in world of diplomacy, I don't think that it's desirable at all to come to the loss of face. If diplomacy is not just, as they say, the bland talking to the bland, it is about finding common denominators, and it's an art of finding ways of accommodation without anyone losing face. And when you look at the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually, there was a good deal of that understanding that it was not to be a loss of face. The Russians withdrew their nuclear missiles, but at the same time, the US also made a commitment not to attack Cuba, and they also made a commitment about no placement of nuclear weapons in Turkey. So there was also elements of diplomacy of avoiding a loss of face. Now, the action that has been taken against the nuclear weapons, instead of a convention, all-embracing convention, has been a fragmentary one to reduce the threats. We have had US and Soviet bilateral agreements on hotlines, on SALT agreement, and START, and INF, etc., and the latest one being the SORT agreement, the Moscow Treaty. But there's been a lot of agreements about prohibiting deployment in various environments. The first one was prohibiting the deployment of nuclear weapons in the Antarctic. It was during the Cold War and was one of the first treaties with the Soviets. There was another one prohibiting the deployment on the seabed, and the next one prohibiting deployment in outer space. So the discussions now about the weaponization of space is not about placement of nuclear weapons there, which would be prohibited, but it's other weapons which may be very bad as well. So these were restrictions in the deployment of the weapons. Then you had something that some of you may remember, a very important treaty named the PTBT, the Partial Test Ban Treaty. And that treaty did not stop the quality development of nuclear weapons, although quantitative, but it did stop testing in the atmosphere and thereby prevented a lot of radioactive fallout that we all suffered from during the period when testing was in the atmosphere. There was then, in 1996, a treaty on the comprehensive ban on nuclear tests in 1996. And it was signed by President Clinton, but it was rejected by the US Senate, partly out of spite against Mr. Clinton, but partly for other reasons by people who wanted to retain the freedom for the United States to test nuclear weapons. 2 years later, you remember that India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons, and they were condemned by the Security Council, including the permanent members, of course, of the US and of China. And in 2006, the North Koreans were similarly condemned by the Security Council for their test. But there is no guarantee that two of those who condemned them, the US and China, which have not ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that they might not one day test weapons again. And in your country, you do have some people who feel that they ought to test nuclear weapons before they go for them. I think that conversely, if the United States were to take up the Test Ban Treaty again, and ratify it, the chances are that China would also go along straight away. And if China did it, I think India would. If India would, I think Pakistan would. If Pakistan did, I think Iran would, and Israel would, and Egypt would also. So a lot it depends upon the issue, and I can see, and the commission I chair can see no measure in the field of disarmament would send a more important signal to the world that yes, we would like to go for disarmament than if the US Senate were to take up the Test Ban Treaty for ratification. I don't see it happening at the moment, but I don't think we should despair about it. I think that all good forces should support that. Now, the key document about the nuclear weapons, rather than those that I've cited, which are important, but the key ones is certainly the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, that's concluded during the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union agreed that more nuclear weapons would be dangerous, that the more triggers there were on the more fingers there were on the more triggers, the more dangerous the world would be. And most of the world agreed with that, especially the Irish took a very active part. But the world would not agree to a double standard. They wouldn't say that, yes, the P5, who now have tested nuclear weapons, they can have it forever, and we shall promise never to touch them. They rather said that, no, you have to commit yourself to negotiate towards nuclear disarmament. We commit ourselves to stay without nuclear weapons, and hence, in due course, when you have negotiated, we will have a world free of nuclear weapons. They also demanded that the nuclear weapon states should share nuclear technology and facilitate for the non-nuclear weapon states to make use of the nuclear technology, whether in medicine, agriculture, or indeed in nuclear power. And the non-nuclear weapon states committed themselves to accept inspection, on-site inspection, safeguards by the IAEA. So the result would have been a free world free of nuclear weapons if they all had fulfilled their obligations in due course. Now, the treaty has had a good deal of successes, and all non-nuclear weapon states accepted the treaty, except for India and Israel and Pakistan. And they, as we know, developed nuclear weapons and have them. There were others, however, who came along and were not there from the beginning. Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan had nuclear weapons on their territory, and when the Soviet Union was dissolved through a skillfully drafted and negotiated agreement, they agreed to transfer their nuclear weapons to Russia. And these three countries are then free of nuclear weapons, and I think we are rather pleased that Mr. Lukashenko in Belarus does not sit on some nuclear weapons today. There were also states which were hesitant at the time and resistant to the NPT, a number of Latin American countries that were skeptical, and they concluded the Latin American Tlatelolco Treaty as a regional non-nuclear weapon-free zone. But among those, Argentina and Brazil, during the time when they had military governments, were certainly had thoughts of going for nuclear weapons, and they have gradually come along, and they had ratified not only the Tlatelolco Treaty, but they also joined the NPT. Now, there were also failures in this treaty. And first of all, there was Iraq that we discovered in 1991. And the inspectors for whom I had a responsibility at the time in the IAEA, when they went in already on the first inspection tour, we could see that they were enriching uranium and that they had an intention to go for nuclear weapons. So that was 1991. Then the year after, 1992, our inspectors had gone to North Korea, and we were able to see that they had reprocessed spent nuclear fuel more than once, and that they must have more plutonium than the number, few hundred grams that they had declared, and that led to the first crisis about North Korea. So these were failures. Then we had Libya. That was discovered not so long ago that they were importing centrifuges and planning nuclear weapons. That was another failure. All the three, Iraq and DPRK and Libya, were parties to the NPT breaches. Iran is the fourth case, and some people ask, are there many more of these? And I think that question perhaps testifies to some lack of knowledge about what the world geography and where different countries are. They point to Syria, Saudi Arabia. I've been to all these countries. I've seen the nuclear installations which they have. And while Saudi Arabia has lots of money, they don't have much by way of research on nuclear yet. Syria is also a very small component. Sometimes I have the feeling that in Washington they think anything outside the Beltway is a potential proliferator. It's not quite that bad, actually. That doesn't mean that there are not dangers, in particular if Iran and North Korea were to go ahead. There is a risk of domino effects. And in the Far East it would be particularly dangerous if the North Koreans were to move on, and if it were to have domino effects in Japan, because that really would increase tensions radically in the Far East. In the Middle East it would take a little longer time, but an Iranian nuclear weapon would also be a serious, very serious affair. So these have been failures, the four failures, and the risk of domino effects. Now, there's also failure on the other side, on the P5 side, those who were to negotiate towards nuclear disarmament. They said they would negotiate, and indeed, nuclear warheads have gone down from the peak 55,000 during the Cold War to something like 27,000 now. So in terms of number, it has gone down. But many people will say this is mostly a question of redundancy, things that they would have done away with anyway. And there's much dissatisfaction among the non-nuclear weapon states that the nuclear weapon states have not taken their duty seriously. There's strain in the groups of states ratifying the treaty. In 1995, this treaty was up for prolongation. It was concluded in 1968, entered into force in 1970 for a period of 25 years. And thereafter, it was to come up for possible prolongation. And it was indeed. And the conference succeeded in getting a prolongation without any final date set. So all the non-nuclear weapon states actually committed themselves to remain with the nuclear weapons for an unlimited period of time. This was a great success. And they would not have gone along with that if it had not been for the nuclear weapon states also confirming the duties that they had undertaken towards nuclear disarmament. So that was a part of the deal. The double bargain of 1968 was then repeated in 1995. And in 1995, I could say there were great hopes after this. There was in 1995 rather good cooperation between the P5 and the Security Council. There were many peacekeeping operations that were decided by the Council in the beginning of the 90s. There was, above all, the success against the Iraqi aggression against Kuwait in 1991, when President Bush very skillfully negotiated an alliance which comprised also Arab states, Syria and Egypt, to take part in subduing the Iraqi aggression. And he spoke actually of a new international order at the time, and we were euphoric about saying that the UN Charter now, at long last, is working as it should. However, the hopes were dashed. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which I mentioned, was defeated in the US Senate, and a doctrine of counter-proliferation was developed in the US. But what did they mean by that? Well, counter-proliferation was undertaken by the Israelis in 1981 when they bombed the Iraqi Osirak reactor and said that this was intended for developing nuclear weapons. May be true. It may also be that if they had not bombed it, any Iraqi tensions would have been discovered by the French technicians and by the inspectors of the IAEA, because they would have had to undertake modifications in it. So Osirak was the first big practice of counter-proliferation. But the background of the theory or the doctrine, I think, was more a feeling that with Iraq violating the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it has sort of demonstrated that treaties are not very reliable, that treaties are respected by the good guys and they are neglected and cheated by the bad guys. So why rely on treaties? Let's rely upon our military strength. And we remember that in the beginning of the 90s, this was the time when the US became the only military superpower in the world. So let's say rely upon that rather than upon treaties. And as to inspection, it was the same thing. They could say that, look, the watchdog that was supposed to bark at any cheating of any country, they didn't see what was going on in Iraq. Well, that's true. IAEA didn't see what went on because the safeguard system, verification system, was so restrained, so restricted in possibilities. They could not go to anything but declared sites, and the Iraqis certainly had many sites that were relevant which were not declared. So I think this was at least part of the background of the doctrine of counter-proliferation, which will rely upon U.S. military ability to strike and U.S. intelligence to decide where would they strike. We remember that the war in 2003, the main justification that was given was that there was a threat of weapons of mass destruction, notably of nuclear weapons. So one might have seen it as an enforcement of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What was then the evidence of the weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons that they invoked? Well, the US and the UK presented what some people since have called faith-based evidence. I think one might even be sharper and say that part of it was fake-based evidence. There certainly was no attack by Iraq. They were in no position to do so. They were on their knees after many years of sanctions. Nor was there the other ground for use of military force under the UN Charter and authorization from the Security Council. The Security Council can, under the Chapter 7, they can authorize the use of armed force in case of a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or active aggression. But there was no threat to the peace even, and the US did not, well, they claimed there was a threat, but the world did not really accept that. Now, we recognize that governments, like prosecutors in trials, will never or very rarely have 100% data. They are in a more difficult position than inspectors. Inspectors, they examine what they see and they report what they have seen. And they can say, this is all, and we don't have more to say. But the governments, they have to act. And they have to do so sometimes, very often, upon less than 100% evidence. What I think one could demand of governments is that they should critically examine what they have. And when you look at them in the Security Council, you also find that governments there are not only prosecutors, as they often are, but they are also judges of the evidence which they submit themselves to their brethren in the Council, and they're also judges on it. They did not critically examine the evidence they had, and frequently the question marks that were handed to them by intelligence organizations became exclamation marks when they were handed by the government officials. The evidence was weakest where it was the most important on the nuclear side, and that, you remember, the Niger contract, the contract alleged to be entered into by Iraq with the state of Niger for the import of uranium oxide, that was proved to be a fake, a forged contract. Mr. Wilson, Ambassador Wilson, had been in Niger already in the year 2002. He did not write about this public until, I think, June 2003, and that gave rise then to a lot of events where you now have seen a lot about the trial of Scooter Libby. However, you might have forgotten or not heard that my colleague Mr. El Baradei revealed in the Security Council before the war that this contract was not, well, he was very courteous as we were, the government said it was not authentic. Maybe they would have listened more to him if he had said it was fake, but being courteous, he said it was not authentic. The IAEA had demanded copies of this contract for a long time, and they were not given it until sometime, I think, in late February 2003. And it had taken them less than a day to see that this was a forgery, because the name of the minister who had signed it was not minister at the time of the contract. The heading of the contract was also a different one from the one used by the state of Niger at the time, and a few other details which made it relatively easy to see that this was a forgery. And of course, many people have asked, how did this come about? And some people say, well, probably the Israelis forged it. But I think most people would say that no, it was not sufficiently clever for having come from the Israeli side. And most people now would guess that it was simply out of commercial interest, getting money. Someone forged it and sold it to the Italian security service that sent it further to the British and to the French and to the Americans. So this piece of evidence, which was certainly very important because it was the most important area, nuclear weapons, was then weak from the beginning, and it was known within the U.S. administration by some people that this was very shaky paper. But there was another piece of evidence that was talked about, and those were the aluminum tubes, which were claimed that these tubes were for the production of centrifuges to enrich uranium. And again, the IAEA had heard about them, it had seen them also before, and they doubted it very much. And there was also doubted by American experts. I remember that David Albright in Washington, for instance, came out in the autumn of 2002 already and doubted it. And El Baradei came to the Security Council before the war and said that the IAEA had concluded that in all likelihood they had nothing to do with enrichment and that they were for rockets. So that was the actual truth. Now, I also read the other day by Frank Rich in the New York Times that when Mr. Cheney had been asked about Mohammed El Baradei's revelation in the Security Council that the contract was not true, he answered at the time that he thought Mr. El Baradei was mistaken. He was not. Now let's say a word about UN inspections. And I headed, as I said a moment ago, I was heading the UN inspectors. I had been at the IAEA up to 1997 when I went into retirement, and then I came out of retirement in the year 2000. And by the time of the invasion in 2003, we had pursued about 700 inspections in 500 different sites. And they were perfectly professional. We were never criticized by anyone, either from the US or anyone else, about the quality of the inspections. We did criticize some of the evidence presented by the US and the UK in very courteous ways. The most interesting feature perhaps was that we asked these countries, US, UK, Germany and others, for sites that they suspected. What did they base their suspicions upon? Tell us, where do you think we should go? You must base your views upon something. So until we had gone in with inspection, we didn't get anything from the US, and I don't really blame them because they said that these guys, we don't know whether they'll get in, why should we give them any information at all? But as we'd gone in, they cooperated very well, and we had good relations with them. And all in all, well, there were many sites given to us, but before the war broke out, we had time to inspect about 3 dozens of these sites. And in no case did we find any weapons of mass destruction because there weren't any. And of course we reported this to the intelligence service as we reported it to the Security Council. And I think it would have been reasonable to expect that the intelligence service would have said that there must be something wrong with their sources if we didn't find anything there, because there was no indication that the Iraqis had moved things away. We did find some conventional weapons in one case, and we found some documents in another case, but no weapons of mass destruction. However, that was not transmitted upward at any rate, and it was thus ignored. I was asked in the Security Council how much more time we would need for inspections, and I said that thinking of the time we would need to go to all the other sites that we've been given, that it was not a question of weeks nor a question of years, but a question of months, and that was perfectly true. Within a few months more, we would have been able to go to all the sites, and we would have been able then reported that there were no weapons of mass destruction. We would not, however, ever get to zero uncertainty, because proving the negative is not possible. We never said there are no weapons of mass destruction. We said this is what we inspected very, very diligently, and we have not found anything. Because a country to be inspected is a big place. And there are many basements, and there are many nooks and corners in the country. And you cannot guarantee that there are not some centrifuge or prototype of a centrifuge or some computer programs somewhere. What we could know was that there was no infrastructure left for nuclear matters. We had understood in the IAEA completely the whole program of nuclear program that they had, and we had also destroyed already by 1997, well, even before that, that infrastructure. There was no infrastructure left, and if there had been some new infrastructure, it would have been visible from satellites, so we were fairly sure about our conclusions. Now, the Europeans and most of the other members of the Security Council wanted to have more inspections. They didn't rule out the use of force forever, but they wanted to have more inspections still in the middle of March 2003. And there was no majority for a war in the Security Council. Some people have said that, look here, they didn't care about inspections at all. This was just a charade. They had decided the war anyway. And so the Security Council was absolutely meaningless operation. Well, I don't think it was, because I think nor do I think that inspections were meaningless, because we had credibility among many members in the Security Council and many members in the UN. If they had gone to the General Assembly, there would have been a very, very strong majority in favor of further inspections and against going to war. And the fact that they could not attain a majority in the Security Council had as an important background that the inspectors had not verified the presence of weapons of mass destruction. So it had an impact. Since then, many people have criticized the Security Council as usual, was impotent, couldn't do anything. But I think the Security Council did absolutely the right thing. What would we have said about the Council today if the Security Council had authorized the war? Well, today we are skeptical that they did go to war, but if the Council also had been in it, then they had committed the same error of judgment. So I think the Council did the right thing. It showed good judgment. Now, the truth, of course, was a casualty, and that's not, regrettably, not so uncommon in public life. And I'll cheer you up a little by another story that I heard from Swedish television about a fellow who was a great storyteller about the hunting and so forth. And he was asked once whether, do you never lie? And he said, no, I never lie. But he was able to spin. I never lie. But I admit, he said, that when there's not enough truth, then I add. But in this manner, you only get a little more truth than there is in reality. And I think that's what happened too often in the case of the evidence and the truth relating to Iraq. After the war, we have seen the New York Times and the Washington Post, important newspapers, apologize for how they overlooked or how they played down the evidence, the skeptical evidence that they had. On the first page, they had evidence that was critical of the Iraqis, and on page 12, there would be something that was more critical of the evidence. And today, I think, in the connection with the trial of Scooter Libby, there are many who are discussing how the media, that should be an independent power, actually was not so independent, but had a tendency to fall in line with the government. Now, the UN inspectors did not. And why not then? Why did we not people think that they were under tremendous pressure, I would say that no, I think the relations with the US and with the other members, the British and others, were quite correct. And with the exception of some pressures that came at the end, and which I described in my book, I think on the whole they were correct relations. However, the media was a different matter. The media were ferocious, and I was sometimes told that they were skinning us alive. Well, we didn't have time to read the media, so we had enough to do in our inspections and reporting under them. But the reason why the inspectors came closer to the reality was that we acted as international civil servants. Civil servants are there to provide the political power holders with the data, with the dossiers. And whether you are in a national civil service or an international civil service, your job is to do a professional job and to be as unbiased and objective as you possibly can. And then it's for them to decide what they will do. They have the political mandate, they may be elected, they sit in the councils and the Security Council of the UN. That's their job, it's not our job. So we saw our function as a modest one, but nevertheless as an important one, and that was to be unbiased. And I think we came rather close to fulfilling that duty. The war was a tragedy, in my view. The weapons of mass destruction was a justification that could be sold, and it was wrong. Another justification given was for that they wanted to establish democracy, hoping that it would be contagious in the region. And we all hope that that will happen one day, but so far I think we have seen more of anarchy than of democracy. Another justification was to give a signal to terrorists that terrorists will be dealt with very severely and that they therefore should stay away from any terrorism. However, we have seen that the Iraq occupation has become more of a breeding ground than a signal to terrorists to stop with their activities. I think that the oil also was a significant factor, although much less discussed. Clearly, the intervention in 1991 against the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait was oil-related, understandably perhaps, but nevertheless oil-related. Many feared that Iraq would move on from Kuwait to the Gulf states and to Saudi Arabia, and that Saddam would sit and control the oil in the Middle East. This time, there was not an occupation of Kuwait. I think there was, as Mr. Wolfowitz said on occasion, there was a need to redeploy troops from Saudi Arabia to a more welcoming environment, and they might well have looked to Iraq for a more welcome environment, providing that Saddam Hussein would be gone. Iraq, after all, have the second biggest oil reserves in the Middle East, and also conveniently a border with Iran and possibility to exert pressure upon the Iranian. The sole success I can see of the war is that Saddam is gone. And he was a brutal dictator. He was someone who thought himself the modern Nebuchadnezzar. He even tried to rebuild and continue building the walls of Babylon. And while Nebuchadnezzar had his initials on the stones, Saddam also had his initials on the stones that were added to the wall. Now, truth was not the only casualty of the war. The lives and resources, of course, the most precious and most important. There was also a casualty in the form of in the UN and the rules that govern the use of force. I mentioned the Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter that prohibits members from using threat or use of force against other members except in self-defense. That was ignored. So I think there was, in 2003, a sort of goodbye to San Francisco, to the UN Charter. But it was in line with the U.S. National Security Strategy of 2002, which authorized preventive war against what was termed growing threats. There were, and there will be difficulties with any preventive war, because while in an armed attack you see it coming, or even when it is imminent, you see it coming across the seas, or navy or missiles. But before any attack has been launched at all, then you must base yourself upon intelligence. And intelligence certainly was not good in this case, nor was it good in the early case. During the Clinton administration, you might remember that they sent cruise missiles after the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. They sent a cruise missile on Afghanistan, and they sent another one on a chemical factory outside Khartoum. And it turned out that this destruction of this factory was totally unjustified, had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. So intelligence is a shaky ground for attacking other countries or their cities. Now, the U.S. philosophy in 2002 that I mentioned, that came at the time of the unipolar world, I started from the premise, as I mentioned, that I think that the U.S. felt able, unlike the UN, to uphold the Non-Proliferation Treaty in a responsible and timely fashion. And that philosophy was confirmed in the National Defense Strategy of 2005, which was unilateralism reigned high as well. And I quote from the Defense Strategy of 2005, where it says that the end of the Cold War and our capacity to influence global events open the prospects for a new and peaceful system in the world. Well, the world of multilateralism was described in 2005 rather as obstacles to the U.S. And I quote another passage from the same document. It says, "Our strength as a nation will continue to be challenged by those who employ a strategy of the weak, using international fora, the UN perhaps, judicial processes, and terrorism." So, as an old UN hand, I find that the international fora are described as an obstacle to the establishment of a new and peaceful system in the world. Well, this was the peak, I think, of the feeling of power, of ability to maintain order in the world. And I don't think there was a bad will behind it, but I think that it was an ambition that the Iraq War showed would be very difficult to maintain. That unilateralism, sometimes with alliances, has also been much in view after Iraq. At the NPT Review Conference in 2005, that's to say 10 years after the prolongation of the treaty, the commitments made in 1995 and the year 2000 were brushed aside. The commitments that had been made by the nuclear weapon states to do seriously disarmament was brushed aside as coming from a different era. And the double bargain was abandoned. It was taken as a breach of promise by the non-nuclear weapon states. The UN summit in 2005 was also ended without any single line about non-proliferation or about disarmament. And the Conference of Disarmament was without a work program for over a decade, the conference in Geneva. Now it seems a little more hopeful. We are coming into an era that may be a little more hopeful, but for over one decade, the negotiation forum of the whole world in Geneva was without a work program. Now, even today, I fear that it is not respect for UN Charter rules about non-use of force that is holding back missiles over Iran. I think there are other reasons that are restraining any impulses to shoot missiles at Natanz and other places. What we see, I think, is a sort of ad hocery. It is not much faith or much reliance on the global order. San Francisco is far away. Yet, we must remember that the authors of the San Francisco Charter were not pacifists, nor am I a pacifist. But the authors of San Francisco Charter were also not trigger happy. They preferred the peaceful settlement where possible. Is then this, you might ask, is this a climate for disarmament that we advocate in this book? Well, clearly we are not thinking that you can have global disarmament overnight. And nor did Mr. Kissinger and his co-authors expect that it would happen overnight. But decisive step towards nuclear disarmament is another matter. A will to get there is another. And it seems to me that there ought to be a possibility to get there. Clearly, international relations are not all sunshine. When we think about the missile shield, or we think about the nuclear agreement with India, etc., they are not all sunshine, nor is the sum of $1.3 trillion a year indicative of intentions to reduce. But an important factor is nevertheless that the Cold War is over, and that was a big event. Armed conflicts between major military powers is nevertheless deemed rather as a remote possibility. And if you look at history, you also see that there have been much less and less war between states. I think you used to have wars with Mexico in the past history. I don't think that you imagined you could have another war with Mexico. Differences, yes, but war, no. In Latin America, they used to have interstate wars, and I think today that's also excluded. If you look at Europe, well, the European Union was conceived as a peace project and works as a peace project, and no Europeans imagine that's possible, that there could be a war again between European states. And they even rule out a war with Russia today. So here's an evolution that has been going on, and that is a hopeful one. Admittedly, Taiwan is a flashpoint today, without some risks, but it's been handled so far with pragmatism and with prudence. You have regional conflicts like the Kashmir, yes, but that's not a world conflict. You have regional conflicts in the Middle East. I don't think they could provoke a world war today, but they could be quite serious. And you have conflicts in Africa about borders between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So you have some. But the bigger picture is one that is much more hopeful. And when you look at what you used wars to be about, you'll find that in the past, they used to be about borders, or about territory, or colonies, or about religion, or ideology. And these factors are no longer really sources of conflicts that can lead to war. So can we expect to have big conflicts between big powers about the, shall we say, exchange rate, the Chinese currency exchange rate, on which there's some friction, or about emissions of carbon dioxide, or the level of immigration or emigration? I don't think so. Now, could there been crisis about who can have what weapons? And the Cuban crisis was one of those. And the case of Iran today is also a case of who can have what weapons. These crises can be handled as they were in the case of the Cuban crisis, by diplomacy, and avoiding also to make anyone lose face. What helps us, I think, and has helped in this very much, is the growing interdependence between states. It's technology that forces us to be much closer to each other, and trade has skyrocketed since the Second World War. This interdependence makes it more difficult to go to armed conflicts. You take the case of Japan and China today, there are lots of emotional, strong feelings in that region, but the exchange of the trade is also enormous between the two, and that is a restraining factor. We also have things that we need to fight together, and must fight together. You take the case of the avian flu. Well, whether we think that North Korea has a horrible social political system, we have to work together in order to prevent the spread of avian flu, SARS, global warming. Even the global economy requires a lot of more closer cooperation, which brings us together and makes it more difficult to tear this global cohesion apart. Does terrorism preclude the disarmament of weapons of mass destruction? I don't think so. Rather, terrorism, the risk of terrorism, requires cooperation between police and intelligence, perhaps helicopters, clean up and preventing that there is highly enriched uranium or plutonium floating around in traffics. It does not require more aircraft carriers or more nuclear weapons. That, in Swedish, we have a saying that you are trying to shoot mosquitoes with cannons. And I think that's what these heavy weapons would be in relation to the terrorists. Are the nuclear weapons needed against rogue states, against a country like Iraq or North Korea or Iran? Well, I think the truth is that one can manage without nuclear weapons. That's certainly not the levels of nuclear weapons that we have today. They are not threatening Iran with nuclear weapons, nor North Korea, but other means are used. In both cases, in Iran and North Korea, I think everybody will conclude today, I hope so, that military action is too risky. And even the current preparations, the current build-up of military forces is a risky one, with 2 aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, and with accusations about the Iran peddling weapons across the border, the tension is high. And sparks could fly in such a situation. In a way, this happened in 2003, when there were over 100,000 men sitting in the desert and could not wait forever, and without affecting morale, and some decision had to be taken. So it's very risky to play up and to reinforce the military pressure. Economic pressure is much less risky. We have seen today now how Iran actually is withdrawing from the cooperation within the IEA because the Security Council has imposed further economic sanctions. But on the whole, economic sanctions do not have the effect of humiliation and insult that a military threat has. A military threat is much more likely to make the people conclude that, yes, we may need weapons, we are under threat, we may need the weapons that they are talking about, and it's more humiliating. It seems to me that the wars in Iraq and also the Lebanon military action in Lebanon suggest a greater restraint in the use of military force. that this experience makes it more likely that the US and the world will come back to negotiations and to non-military means. And the chances are that if they had not gone to war, in the case of Iraq, then Saddam would have developed a little like Gaddafi. He would have faded. He was 10 years older than in 1990 when he attacked Kuwait, and he had no weapons, and the country was on its knees. Now, in the circumstances that I have described, namely the accelerating interdependence of states and the absence of substantive conflicts between the great powers, and the disastrous experience of the recent military reliance on the military force, and the limited usefulness of heavy weaponry against terrorists, and the horrific economic burden of the current defense spending, the revival of disarmament should be possible. And Kofi Annan was here, I think, in this room, and said that this revival requires, if you are an airplane, 2 wings you need for an airplane 2 wings. One is non-proliferation wing of the countries that don't have nuclear weapons. The other one, the wing, is for the nuclear weapon states to disarm. You need both of those in order to go forward. Now, persuading states like North Korea and Iran to stay away from nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction and to respect the common rules of international society would prove less difficult if regime change, however desirable it might seem, were generally left to the people of the states concerned, and if the UN Charter rules regarding the use of armed force were recognized as guiding and respected. Secondly, if states were offered such guarantees about their security that they no longer feel a need for nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction. And thirdly, if the states of concern, or the rogue states, were made part of the international cooperation rather than being isolated as pariahs. If you think of North Korea today, I think they are on the right track, that they are saying that, yes, we will help you to a better economic development, and through the World Bank and others, and through assistance with heavy oil, provided that you go along with doing away with the nuclear program. That would be a big carrot. They might hold up Vietnam as an example, where a government is transformed, still a communist government, but is transformed into a more modern type of government, just like Deng Xiaoping did also in China. Now, dissuading countries to go for nuclear weapons would also be easier if the nuclear weapon states set an example by moving away from these weapons rather than developing them, as the US and the UK seem to do. If, in short, we aim at a rule-based system, valid for all rather than double and multiple standards, in which the UK and the US develop new standard nuclear weapons, while Iran is threatened with cruise missiles if it goes ahead with enrichment, and in which North Korea and India and Pakistan are condemned for testing weapons, while the US and China retain the freedom to test by refraining from ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So I'm coming to my conclusion, and that is that it should be possible, with political will, to move the world towards nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and this would reduce the threat of nuclear attacks by design or by accident, and it would save enormous resources. This was indeed the conclusion of the former Secretaries of State Kissinger and Schultz, and former Secretary of Defense Perry, who was a member of my commission, and Senator Nunn in their article in the Wall Street Journal. Now, these seasoned statesmen from the Cold War, they were no doves, urged the US to launch a major attack, first and foremost to an effort, first and foremost in intensive work with the leaders of the countries that have nuclear weapons, to turn, as they say, I quote the article, to turn the goal of a world without nuclear weapons into a joint enterprise. They ought to receive a positive response from the UK government, because in a letter that accompanied a white paper from the UK government about the necessity for the prolongation of our nuclear weapons program, the Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett wrote, and I quote her, "We stand by our unequivocal undertaking to accomplish the total elimination of nuclear weapons, and we will continue to press for multilateral negotiations towards mutual, balanced, and verifiable reductions in nuclear weapons." So that was a letter that accompanied the white paper in which they said it was necessary to extend the Trident program. Well, more specifically, what should the nuclear weapon states be asked to do at the present time? Well, Mr. Kissinger and his co-authors pointed to the fulfillment of the bargain, the double bargain under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And like the commission that I headed, they called for a series of steps. We recommended action of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty as the most important, and taking nuclear weapons off had trigger alert, where many of them are at the present time, and banning the further production of fissile material, let's say highly enriched uranium or plutonium, for weapons, and avoiding a race, arms race in space, and eliminating short-range nuclear weapons. We see no reason why there should be a lot of nuclear weapons in Western European territory and in Russian territory not far from Europe. The authors of the Wall Street Journal article rightly also point to the need for efforts to resolve regional confrontations and conflicts that give rise to new nuclear powers. And indeed, perceived threats to security provide the major impulses for proliferation. So peace treaties in the Middle East and Korea would help very much to reduce any risk or any impulses to proliferation. And let me end then by adding that the United Nations remains not the only, but a vital instrument to be used for the resolution of conflicts, and that the Charter still provides the fundamental guidelines which should be respected. And my countryman, Dag Hammarskjöld, once said that the UN is not there to take us to heaven, but rather to help us avoid going to hell.
Dr. Blix has agreed to take questions, and we have a little bit of time. There is a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. I will call on you. There's a question up here. All the way up. It's the gentleman. Okay. Very well. Here it. Okay, and then we'll come down.
We recently had a lecture here at Princeton by a Rutgers environmental science professor about some recent work they did on nuclear winter scenarios. And they reran the scenario with thousands of weapons. They ran one with 100 weapons, such as might happen with an all-out exchange between India and Pakistan. And the results came out similar to previous studies on that, except I don't know how many studies were on the 100 weapons. That 100-weapon exchange did cause a severe weather perturbation, very, very damaging. All-out nuclear winter just caused a complete disaster. So anybody that uses that kind of deterrent will, in fact, destroy their own country, it seems to me. And I think it would seem to me that would play a big factor in any disarmament negotiations, I would hope. Unfortunately, that another possibility remains that 5 nuclear weapons could be launched against any state, say Iran or any future state that wants to become a nuclear power, and might be a deterrent against doing that. And that will not have a major effect on the global weather. I don't know what the Bush administration is thinking, but I welcome any of your comments on any of these observations.
Well, wasn't it Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan who said that nuclear weapons are weapons that the nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought? So in some ways nuclear weapons are more theoretical than real, and we often hear from the military that they don't like the nuclear weapons. They cost a lot of money, but they are very uncertain of their military utility. They would rather have things which they could plan with, and they cannot plan the use of nuclear weapons. But we haven't seen that this really has deterred the political decision makers from retaining a capacity. What you are saying is, I think, squares very much with what the World Health Organization has been doing and saying for many years. They have been assessing the damage that would come from any use of nuclear weapons. And I think one could put big question marks about would it really be doable for even a country like Israel to use nuclear weapons. They have about 200 nuclear weapons as a sort of life insurance, and I think there would be a very, very extreme situation in which they would contemplate the use of nuclear weapons. By contrast, you might say that there might be rogues, there might be a terrorist, would not be deterred, they are not, have no fixed abode, etc. But the chances of terrorists getting nuclear weapons is also much lesser. They're much more likely that the terrorists, if they were looking in that direction, would make a dirty bomb. Handling a nuclear weapon is a fairly big affair, after all. The dirty bomb is something where you put cesium or cobalt in some container and with conventional explosives, and you set it off in some big public place where it would not cause all that many casualties, but would cause the terror effect would be very considerable, and the contamination would be. So I think the considerations that you say are, yes, they are valid, but as often you cannot say that the risk is zero.
There's a gentleman here in the middle, and then we'll go back. No, the third row up, the gentleman in the yellow sweater. Thank you. And then we can save time if we take it like 2 rows farther back. There's a woman in the center.
Just by coincidence, I was listening to an interview between Charlie Rose and Kissinger this morning, a repeat of their Friday night program. And he introduced one factor, which I'd like your comments on. It relates somewhat to what you just said. But he pointed out that a real difficulty has arisen now because you just don't negotiate with nation states. You have a large group of people who are not nation states, terrorists or bands of terrorists, who can do evil things at no danger to, and no concern about losing their own life, and that these represent a danger which just having treaties between nation states would not, even if you could get that, would not ameliorate. I wonder what your comments are, because it left me very depressed to think of, even if you can negotiate between states, you still have this huge, we don't know how many, number of people who are dedicated to major destruction, and they can get cobalt and stuff. They can also, in all probability, in the extreme, get material to make at least a small nuclear weapon. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that saying that there's a huge number of people is probably to exaggerate it. What we have seen of terrorists so far is a preference for very conventional explosives. And not for any weapons of mass destruction. We've had a case of a sect in Japan that used sarin in the subway of Tokyo. That is true. And they had experimented. They had lots of money to experiment with biological weapons, but did not succeed. And the production, especially the dissemination of biological weapons is not so easy. We've had a case in this country of the use of biological weapons by someone who was accomplished in anthrax, and who used the U.S. mail as a distribution service, and did kill a number of people. And I think that you're right, that the terrorists will not be deterred. They have no fixed abode, and they will not be deterred. They risk their own lives, so they could have a greater effect if they were able to master the weapons of mass destruction. But it is not so easy, fortunately. And as I said, I think that the dirty bombs may be more likely than the real bombs. And a lot of work is being undertaken in order to clean up, to avoid that plutonium or rich uranium is floating around. And what we have seen so far has been scams, most of it, much of it shortly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when controls were not so good. Well, they have now had over 15 years to strengthen the control. And still, as the other day we learned that 100 grams of highly enriched uranium had been seized in Georgia from somebody. But it's still, as I said, you can never put the risks at zero in this, but so far we have not had any major tendencies for terrorist groups to use weapons of mass destruction. It would be very difficult for them to do with the nuclear weapons. And what we have seen of Al-Qaeda's interest in it was apparently rather amateurish stuff.
We'll take a final question, the woman in the center. Thank you.
One of the things that I was wondering about was the physical act of disarmament. Like, how would you go about disarming so many bombs? I mean, there's a lot of them, and it seems to me that that poses as much of a problem, even if you get the states to agree to disarm. The actual act of doing it seems to me to pose as much of a problem as getting them to agree to do it.
I believe the question concerned the difficulty of the dangers inherent in disarmament, getting the states to agree to disarmament and bring as many hazards as they want.
Well, disarmament is not free of charge. It costs the U.S. government quite a lot to destroy the chemical weapons they have, and the same thing for Russia. You also have to do something with if you don't destroy chemicals, you deal with nuclear weapons, you will get a lot of plutonium, you get a lot of enriched uranium. Enriched uranium is relatively easy. You can dilute it, and you can burn it up in nuclear reactors. Plutonium you can mix with uranium and get mixed oxide fuel, but it's not without problems. That is quite sure. It costs money. But I would say that as a general rule, it is better that material is as far away from bomb readiness than that is closer. Now, some people say that, well, they sit there in the bombs, then they're pretty secure. And bombs are well kept and stored, and that may be true. But I think that the better rule of the thumb would be to move it as far away from the bomb. Move it first away from hair trigger alert, because that's the most dangerous. And then move away the warheads from the missiles, and then take away the bombs from areas where there is no need for them, like the European continent at the present time. Dismantle as much as you can, do away with the fissile material, and burn it up in reactors. This be the good policy. And that's the one that I think is followed on the whole, but it's too little and it's too slow. And there is also the fact today that public opinion has not been so interested in disarmament after the end of the Cold War. We all drew a sigh of relief when the Cold War was over and said that, well, now there is no mutually assured destruction any longer, and we began to look instead at the global warming, which is quite right. I mean, Al Gore is right about this. This is an inconvenient truth, and we need to focus upon it. In the long run, perhaps I feel even more worried about the environmental questions than about the weapons of mass destruction. But we need to have both these inconvenient truths in mind and do something about them. Maybe it's that we, as human beings, we all have a need of our daily anguish for something, whether it be the mobile phones or cholesterol and weapons of mass destruction are served very well as a source of anguish. But we need, I think, to keep even a cool head in assessing how big are the dangers, how big is the risk that terrorists actually would succeed in doing something by biological weapons or succeed in stealing sufficient large quantities of plutonium. We need to have these risks in perspective. It's very easy to get a bit too agitated about it, and we cannot be complacent, no. We cannot say that risks are zero, but you have to take measures, but I don't think one should need to be frantic either.
Thank you very much.